So we are a research institute, as you know, so we are fundraising all the time. We are fundraising for democracy because that's what we research, we teach. We also do some kind of pro-democracy activity, so we are fundraising all the time and oftentimes to private donors. So philanthropy is in our daily experience. So this is what we will talk about in this last panel. A private money for good, if that exists at all. Shakuntala earlier today said that there is not something like wealth for good, but we might see, we can discuss that later. So we will talk about billionaires and companies, wealthy people, individuals, who actually commit themselves for public good, for the betterment of society, even for deepening democracy. Philanthropy exists for ages, actually from the ancient times, from Plato Academy. The word itself means the love of humanity. Philanthropy was present ever since the ancient times. Most of the time, this was private donorship for those who were in need, for arts, culture specifically. So what we are talking about today is the modern understanding of philanthropy, which was formulated in forms of large-scale foundation, typically in the 19th and the 20th century, fueled by the industrial wealth, with the purpose to address social problems. So these modern foundations have the strategic means and aims to pursue the betterment of societies. They are looking for long-term solutions and try to go to the roots of the problems. Global philanthropy is also globalizing and it's growing. In the 21st century, this became also much more visible than before. So there was a recent global philanthropy report of the Harvard Kennedy School. So I tell you a couple of data of what we're talking about. So first of all, in 2018, the global reach of philanthropy covered something like 260,000 foundations all over the world, typically 39, 40 countries of the world. Obviously, most of those are in the United States, in North America, and in Europe. Actually, 95% of all donations, all philanthropy organizations are in the classic West. 5% are obviously then on the rest of the world. 2/3 of these foundations were formed after 2000. So many of them are very new foundations. 90% of those old foundations consider themselves independent from their funders, typically in Europe and the US. Many are corporate foundations, typically in Latin America. There are government-related philanthropy organizations in China and in the Middle East, and there are family foundations, which are the most typical form of philanthropic foundations in Africa. All these foundation assets, according to this study, is 1.5 trillion US dollars, and they spend altogether 10% of those endowment annually, so 150 billion US dollars per year. The most typical focus, purpose of these organizations are education, most 35%, human services, social welfare, 20%, health, 20%, art and culture, 18%, poverty alleviation, 16%, no data about democracy support. There are also all kind of new formats of the activities. Multi-donor corporations are coming, though these are very complicated. There are public-private collaborations, and there is more research and evaluation on the impact of the foundations in recent years. So, what we are talking about is philanthropic practices, which are in somewhat a problem, because philanthropic practices of elites with significant financial power raise important political and democratic questions. Granting power based on wealth undermines the fundamental democratic principles, especially on electoral representation, accountability, and equality. Distribution of the roles between elite, states, and markets carries profound democratic implications. So this is what our panel will discuss today, all the promise and pitfalls of democracy, and we have wonderful panelists, Alvaro Morcillo, Inderjeet Parmar, and Niamh McCrea from Ireland. So Alvaro, the floor is yours.
Thank you to Andrea, Andreas, and to Zsuzsanna, and to the other organizers for inviting me. I'm going to talk about philanthropic foundations and how they can harm or help democracy. The first minutes of this presentation will be a bit US-centered, but then I'm going to talk about what foundations do abroad. This might not be obvious for you, but my whole reasoning is based on archive research, which I've done, and this research refers to activities of the philanthropic foundations overseas, seen from the United States. I'm thinking of development policy, research and education in developing countries, rural development, and global health, and also democracy promotion. If someone has interest on how I do the connections between the ideas that I'm going to present and the evidence related to these global policies, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. After showing the relevance of philanthropic given to contemporary politics by having a look to what is going on in the US and its legal system nowadays, I will explain how you can turn, or how philanthropic foundations turn, excessive wealth into a form of power. And then I will go deeper into how the daily work of a philanthropic foundation, of a donor, actually looks like. So, without further ado, let me talk a bit about contemporary judicial politics in the US today. The three lines in green which you can see are headlines from the New York Times from the last weeks. As you might have noticed, Trump continues winning cases in front both of the Supreme Court and of the district courts. And this is the result of a major transformation in the US judicial system. And this transformation, in turn, builds upon a situation which was born during the Cold War years, in which the judiciary was actually dominated by the so-called liberal legal movement. I'm thinking of the 1960s, 1970s. This is a time in which all the important institutions for the US legal system were occupied by liberals and people who came from liberal institutions, or people who were former appointees from democratic presidents. People coming out of the Kennedy administration went into major universities and law schools, and also to foundations, to philanthropic foundations. And other liberals were people who have been active during the New Deal and were liberals and were pro-state intervention into the economy, pro-regulatory action on the part of the federal state. And as a result of this, or part of this increasing control by liberals of the legal system in the U.S., there was a significant intervention of donors, in particular of the Ford Foundation, which paid for the Sierra Club, for Georgetown Institute of Public Interest, for the American Civil Liberty Union, and someone who has studied in detail the conservative legal movement, and the quotation is from him, Stephen Telles, concludes that it's highly unlikely that public interest law would have gotten off the ground were it had not been for the support of the Ford Foundation. So this is to explain that the money of the foundations can be used for liberal causes, but it can also be used for other causes. And in fact, what we have observed in the 1970s is an increasing presence of conservative people in the US legal establishment. And most famous case is the Federal Society, which is the one which supports young conservative legal scholars from the beginning of their careers, with the target of placing these people in the higher courts of the United States and in the Supreme Court, which is what they actually achieved during the first Trump mandate. But also the law and economic movement is a case of a conservative swing within the US legal system. And again, here the funders played a significant role. The Koch brothers, the Olin Foundation, Bradley Foundation, and Smith Richardson Foundations. So the wealth, the excessive wealth, which is organized in the philanthropic foundations, can help, from the perspective of many of those who are here, to buttress democracy and liberalism, or it can also go the other way. How does this happen? So we are talking of different goals, but now I'm going to go deeper into how does this happen, which are the instruments, and which are the social scientific contexts which are relevant. In a sense, this is a problem of social power, or in my own vocabulary, of domination. And what we see here is a definition of power as a relation between two individuals in which the distribution of courses of action open to every one of the two individuals or organizations, if you want, is unequal. One has many courses of action open, and the other has very few. Obviously, the actor which has many courses of action open is the foundation, and the one which doesn't have so many courses of action open is the recipient. An NGO, a research center, a university in a developing country, or the health system in Bolivia, just to put an example. This is a picture that I took during the presentation of Katarina Pistor's, and what I try to do with the picture is to establish a connection between what I'm telling you about power, domination, and asymmetry of resources, and what she explained about the transformations of the law. And what I'm going to explain goes into the last square on the right, private power based on private wealth. In fact, you see the three concepts there: private wealth, private autonomy, lack of accountability. Philanthropic foundations embody these properties perfectly well. The endowments of the foundation are the private wealth. The ability of the foundations to establish their own policies is the private autonomy. And the lack of accountability corresponds to the fact that the philanthropic foundations have boards which reproduce themselves, and apart from a very sketchy declaration to the Internal Revenue Service, they have to offer very little accountability to the US government. And before I forget, and I should have said this from the very beginning, what I'm telling here refers not to the variety of philanthropic foundations Zsuzsanna mentioned earlier, but to a very small but very significant subset, the so-called General Purpose Foundation, which is a foundation which has in its charter not a specifically defined goal. So the board can redefine the goals of the foundation, the purpose for which it uses the foundation money every time the board wants or the board identifies new necessities or new goals. And this is the way in which a couple of foundations operate and have sufficient amount of money. I'm actually thinking of about 20 foundations, all of them based in the US. So we have here another slide from Professor Pistor, and you see open property rights, power over others in relation to an expanding set of resources. You see here the connection between the idea of property rights, the expansion of resources, and and the definition that I use refer to the course of actions relevant for the interaction between individuals. The actor who has more resources has more courses of action open. And the philanthropic foundations, the wealthy actor has more resources because the property rights endow the foundation with the monetary resources. But I'm also going to show you that this asymmetry of resources does not only refer to property rights, so to material resources, but also to information and prestige. So let me move on. So here is my question. How do wealthy donors exploit to the full the asymmetry of resources that frequently characterize donor-recipient relations? The way I see these relations between donor and recipient is the classic way in which you see a relation of dominations between a leader, which is at the command of an organization, and people who form, who are part of the organization, but don't have a say on setting the policies of the organization. The puzzle for me was, how do actually the foundations use this money and the other resources they have at their disposal to restrict the courses of action which are open to the recipient? And part of the answer is, of course, that the foundation has a staff which is dedicated to implement the policies of the foundation, for instance, to promote certain forms of global health. Well-known case is Bill Gates, which has this idea of global health as something based on magic pallets to distribute vaccines rather than improve health facilities in small communities. So Gates defines a policy and objectives, and he has a staff of people dedicated to enforce them. The question is, what happens next? The foundations have a staff, and the staff is in relation to grantees and potential grantees, but what does the staff do in their practical everyday work? How do they convince, if I take an example from research and higher education, how does a donor convince a research center that a certain agenda is the best one for the research center, or a certain teaching program is the most promising one? And where I conclude, after years looking into grant files, is that the staff of the foundations encounters the recipients and the potential recipients with and displays a set of practices. And these practices are always oriented toward reducing the courses of action available to the potential recipient. And these practices are also geared towards increasing the resources that the wealthy philanthropic foundation has, and if possible, reducing those available to the potential recipient. What do the members of the foundation staff do? They collect information while trying to reduce the information which is available to the recipient or the potential recipient. That's on the one side, information hoarding and processing information, and on the other side, managing the silence. I'm an employee from a foundation, I ask questions, you answer the questions because you want to get my support, but I will tell you very little about my intentions or my plans or my agenda. Another practice is geared towards reducing another resource, namely time. The foundation will set the pace of negotiation and will always also establish when the money can be spent. And this has the effect of reducing the course of action for a recipient which might be in need of money. And if the time goes by and the foundation does not make a decision, the recipient is going to have difficulties to ask another alternative funder for the money. A fifth practice is doctoring. The foundations don't give you money necessarily to do what you want to do. They give you money to do what is in their agendas. And part of this is that the foundation's officers rewrite grant applications. This is what I call doctoring. So the potential grantee will approach the foundation with an idea, and the foundation will cut corners in order to reduce the budget. But very frequently, the foundation will also have additional ideas or alternative ideas about what the grantee could do, and these things that the grantee could do are the ones the foundation is ready to pay for. And another important practice is to give rejections and to make very clear that the foundation can deny an application. Why is this crucial? Because the threat, the shadow of the rejection is what makes the other practice effective. So if you don't give me information, I won't give you the money. If you don't keep the deadlines or accept the deadlines that I impose you, I won't give you the money. There is another practice which is not mentioned here, but it's also crucial, which is conditionality. And of course, conditionality, which is not something which was invented by the IMF or by the World Bank, but by the Rockefeller and Carnegie philanthropists in the interwar period. This works only under the shadow of denials and rejections. And by the way, foundations are also very, very conscious about the fact that the true source of their power is what they call the power of declination, namely their ability to say no. And the reason why they think this is so crucial is the following. But first, a part of this idea of management of silence and keeping information for themselves is related to the following thought. If I give you information about my reasons why I'm not going to give you the money, you are going to raise questions afterwards, and I'm going to be limited in my leeway, in my freedom of saying no. This is one reflection, but the other, which you can see on file, is that foundations are powerful because there are always more potential grantees than money available. And it is by saying no and possibly, and when they say no, they possibly scupper alternative projects, alternative ideas of global health, alternative ideas of rural development, alternative ideas of social science research. And this scuppering, this denying competitive ideas is a crucial part of their power. So not only helping the ones they prefer, but also making things more difficult for their rivals. And with this I come, this is an example of the management of silence. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Let me come to my conclusion so that Zsuzsanna doesn't have to tell me to leave the room. Billionaires and philanthropists can use excessive wealth to advance democracy, but they can also use that wealth to harm democracy. We have seen the examples of the legal and of the legal conservative, the legal movement, the liberal legal movement in the US, but also of the conservative one. Of course, the only way of preventing conservative donors from using their help to, from using their wealth to harm democracy is that this wealth is not accumulated in the first place, which is quite difficult. But of course, one possibility is to entertain good relations to wealthy liberal donors, which are going to support us, but they are not always available, as I already mentioned. The last important idea, even in the cases in which wealth is used to support causes we like the Ford Foundation funding human rights activism since the 1970s, first in Latin America and then worldwide. Even in those cases, where I see is that the means are not really liberal. These are relations of domination. Even when a donor wants to advance a liberal cause, the logic, the organizational logic is still there. So you have a donor with an agenda and policy goals, and it's going to give the money conditioned only to the recipient doing the things that the donor would like the recipient to do. And the donor will redefine the goals of the recipient or only fund the goals of the recipient that the donor likes. So this is also a source of normative danger. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. And thank you very much. Do you want to pull this down? Okay, my voice is pretty loud anyway. But thank you very much for inviting me to present some of my work here. I've enjoyed all the presentations actually in the last 2 days, and I've picked up a few points which kind of align and sometimes disalign with some of the things I want to say. The title of my remarks is actually Wealth Concentration and Democracy, Case of the Hewlett Foundation in an Era of Polycrisis. So my remarks are going to be sort of broadly general, about the kind of some of the issues and ideas which have come up at this conference, which align with some of what I've been doing in my own research. But I'm also going to make some more detailed, specific references to an article that I've written recently on the Hewlett Foundation. If you like, Hewlett-Packard were the original tech bros from the 1930s and 1940s, and were the kind of effectively the founders of what came to be known as Silicon Valley. And they play a very important role, or at least Hewlett plays a very important role today. And there's not a huge amount of work which has been done on the Hewlett Foundation. Just to reiterate a couple of points about the concentration of power that philanthropy, so-called philanthropy, or corporate foundations represent. Is a quote from the socialist American Dwight McDonald in the 1920s, where he says that foundations are large pots of money surrounded by people who want some. There's another quote from a British socialist called Harold Lasky, who argues that it only takes a foundation to declare an interest in a particular topic in a grant program for large numbers of academics to finally realize that they were interested in that subject all along. Which is to say, large amounts of wealth do concentrate minds, and they do have a great power of attraction, and they create, if you like, the basis of knowledge, very powerful kinds of knowledge. And because American foundations tend to be, on the whole, quite utilitarian, they tend to be related to practice and policy. They tend to be networked knowledge with policymakers. The kind of things I've studied is relation to the Pentagon and the State Department and to the White House and other agencies of the American state in the rise to globalism. So I'm going to I picked up 7 things I thought worthy of mention, which relate to the sort of specifics of my work on the Hewlett Foundation, which I'll get to. The first issue is really, we talk about the issue of democracy under pressure or democratic backsliding. And very often that is we talk about the sort of slide towards authoritarianism, and sometimes even variations of fascism. And I just wonder whether we are a little bit too conservative, even in use of the term excessive wealth concentration. It suggests that there is some place where wealth concentration is actually fully and utterly acceptable. And I think democratic backsliding and some drift towards authoritarianism risks being too soft on what is the direction of movement, which is to pointing out enemies within major polities and the identification and targeting of those minorities who dare to dissent and so on, and the closing down of spaces for dissent and so on. And I think it's important to recognize those, because the suppression of internal dissent historically has also led to external identification of threats, enemies, the manufacture of threats, as well as the drift towards war. The second point I kind of picked up and I found interesting in, especially yesterday's, was the use of the word tensions. There are tensions between capitalism and democracy. I would argue that there's a bit more than a tension here, that there is an almost direct contradiction between capitalism and democracy. Capitalism, as our opening keynote speaker said yesterday, preceded democracy by quite a long time. It was dragged kicking and screaming into democracy when that democracy threatened to become a bit more democratic than they were willing to allow it. So I'd argue there are sort of major contradictions to be had there. The third point is to do with liberalism. Now, a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of oligarchs. Often they're particularly right-wing, even authoritarian or fascistic in character. But actually, what I've found in the work that I've done, and I think what people have mentioned here too, is that there's a very strong linkage between the extreme right and also elements of liberalism. That even unwittingly, liberalism and the failures of liberalism, the failure to provide services to the population by liberal regimes, often leads people to draw conclusions which are more right-wing in electoral terms, which is to say that the paving of the way to authoritarian and even fascism often lies within liberal failure itself. And there is a very strong connection, I would argue, between them. In my own work, for example, on think tanks and foundations in the United States, we've seen the alliance of George Soros' money with David and Charles Koch's money in the formation of a think tank called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a kind of a critical position on American kind of interventions, but nevertheless suggests where there is alliances between the so-called liberals and so-called far right as well. The next point I would kind of pick up is that wealth concentration, philanthropy and its programs and its intellectual paradigms are also linked with geopolitics. We often see foundations and other bodies as largely domestically kind of interested and developed and so on. But actually a large part of what they innovate in terms of their domestic knowledge production is the preparation of the state and the society for global intervention. So the 3 big foundations that I've looked at historically, Rockefeller, Ford and Carnegie, played very major roles in the domestic transformation of education, the linkage of graduate education for purposes of diplomacy and war and so on with the White House and the National Security Council and other organs of the state in order to intervene and thereby change the geopolitical competition, intervene in that geopolitical competition. And we can see this during the World War II, in the Cold War, and now in the kind of on-off Cold War with China as well. This particular panel is called Promise and Pitfalls of Philanthropy. And I think pitfalls falls into the area of tensions. I think it's a bit more than a pitfall. It is a direct threat to democracy. And I would argue we have to look at the political economy of the big foundations. Where do they get their money? What kind of economic relations are they engaged in? And what kind of networks are they involved in order to fully understand what they stand for? Another point I think which is really important, and I think I'm guilty of this also, is I focused on elites and elite power and that kind of thing, is that we tend to sideline the importance of youth, of students, of women, of minorities, of workers, of migrants, that is grassroots organizations and what they stand for and when they mobilize and how they can shape the context within which philanthropy and big power actually operates. And I think it's the dynamic between the two which really tells us the ways of directions of change in any particular polity. Another point is to do with liberal philanthropy. And that's what the Hewlett Foundation research has led me to, is that liberal philanthropy is very good at identifying and using the terminology of crisis. And nowadays we have this era called polycrisis, and that questions need to be asked, statements need to be made, solutions need to be found, and sometimes these crises are even referred to as being systemic. But it's very interesting when we unpack the term crisis, it has many, many meanings. And many meanings, there are many different ways in which crisis can be used. And very often it boils down in the end to crisis management with a view to moderating the level of change which actually may well be required. And often the agents of that particular change, the moderate change, are the very agents which have caused the problems from which a crisis has occurred in the first place. And the last thing I would just say is in terms of corporate philanthropy. It is corporate philanthropy. It's corporate love of mankind. And that's a very peculiar kind of love, which basically tries to engineer systems which will continue to perpetuate their kind of positions. That corporations love wealth. They don't necessarily love ideologies, or the only ideologies they tend to love are those which will continue to perpetuate their profit-making activities themselves. So I think a lot of those points occurred to me as people were speaking yesterday, and it felt to me that it aligns with or intersects with the way in which I've approached the study of the Hewlett Foundation. Now, the Hewlett Foundation has an endowment of about $13 billion. It has major networks in corporations and so on. It has networks which are networked with the media, with the political parties, with both sets of administrations, and its networks extend into the universities, into the think tank world. That is to say, there's a whole ecosystem at the center of which Hewlett stands. But because Hewlett is a relatively small or maybe medium-sized foundation, it has developed great skill in leveraging its positions, particularly in this particular era of so-called polycrisis. Hewlett was probably the first major American foundation to take seriously the idea of polarization, the decrease in the significance and importance of neoliberalism, and come up with the idea of post-neoliberalism, and also democratic backsliding, which was occurring in the United States, and that the American system of government was becoming increasingly dysfunctional, illegitimate, losing legitimacy, and therefore leading to a further degree of kind of political and other chaos. And it effectively inaugurated programs on which it itself spent around $50 to $70 million, but because of its ability to convene, they convened another 20 foundations, including Ford and many others, such that they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars since 2014 on the programs of post-neoliberalism, democratic backsliding, polarization, and so on. I think the main thing I would say in my last 30 seconds is that this top-down, technocratic kind of a reform program is extremely superficial. It doesn't say it wants to challenge neoliberalism, but it wants to develop post-neoliberalism, which is to say it's not abandoning many of the tenets of that particular system and the inequalities and the polarization it's caused. And at a very early stage, in their sort of attempts to sort of resurrect American democracy and to re-legitimize it and popularize it and so on, they openly rejected any funding for grassroots or civil or campaign organizations, trade unions, or any of those kinds of movements themselves. They decided that labor lawyers were the better people to go to ask about how to tackle inequality among the people of the United States than it was to go to the people who actually, they themselves recognized, had historically helped to reduce the levels or check the levels of inequality itself. So the Hewlett Foundation sent a lot of people, of them were appointed to the Biden administration. They played a very big role in the development of Biden economics and the launching of Bidenomics. And many people argued that Bidenomics was effectively America first with a brain. And the Hewlett Foundation was suggested to be that particular brain. It was also done in the context of this increasing geopolitical and geoeconomic competition with China, with a view to containing Chinese power and to resurrecting American power itself in the world. I'll stop there because people are itching to get me off the stage, but I will take any questions you might have later on. Thank you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. As the slide suggests, I'm going to ask the question, should egalitarian movements accept philanthropic funding? But just by egalitarian movements, I'm obviously speaking about groups engaged in collective action against the economic, cultural, and political inequalities generated by systems such as capitalism, racism, homophobia, patriarchy, and so forth. So at the heart of the dilemma I will examine is that all too familiar left problem. Should we pursue reforms that make minor improvements in people's lives or hold out for more radical change? Or, as Andre Gors has helpfully developed this question in a more nuanced way, should we engage only in those reforms that make radical change more rather than less likely, or that open up new ways of doing things rather than reinforcing the unequal patterns and relations that already exist? So this problem, which is often debated in fairly abstract terms on the left, really comes home to roost when small, generally under-resourced egalitarian movements contemplate philanthropic funding. The amount of money on offer, or potentially on offer, would go a long way towards achieving some immediate goals, but does accepting the money make that group complicit in, or worse, help reproduce and legitimate global systems of wealth concentration that have been so eloquently described by my fellow panelists? So in my own life, as an academic, I've carried out a fair bit of research on the ethics and politics of philanthropy, but in my real life, if I want a better word, I've also engaged in social activism, in anti-capitalist social activism. And so I'd like to begin by reflecting on an experience I had as an activist that brought these issues into sharp relief, not just for me, but for the whole group of activists with whom I was working. So in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, I was involved in the Irish branch of ATTAC. Some of you are probably aware of that organisation. It's a network organisation which campaigns on financial justice issues such as the regulation of the financial markets, the closure of tax havens, and the cancellation of unjust debt. So at an activist gathering in Paris, my friend and I were unexpectedly approached, and admittedly this is probably an unusual experience, by a representative of George Soros's Open Society Foundations to explore if and how a funding application might be advanced. Now, at this time, we in the Irish chapter were a tiny and informal group. We didn't even have a bank account. So I think the prospects of actually getting that money were probably pretty remote. But unsurprisingly, for an organisation whose foundational slogan is literally was to disarm the financial markets, the idea of accepting funding from a foundation established by a financier prompted some debate, both within the Irish chapter and among our colleagues in the European network. So opponents of the idea objected on the grounds that accepting money from a financier amounted to an endorsement of his wealth and power, providing cover for the very system we sought to transform. They also raised concerns about reputational damage to the group. And by contrast, those more amenable to the idea argued that it presented an opportunity to use capitalist wealth against itself, so to speak. That is to say, to put Soros's ill-gotten gains to work in the broader project of eroding financial power. They also reminded the group that we had no money whatsoever and were reliant on the commitment of a very small bunch of busy activists. Accessing funding could help us build our membership and mount stronger campaigns. So, this shows, I think, that this is a kind of a live issue for movements, for contemporary movements. But I think what's also noticeable about this discussion that we had in Dublin is that each side of the debate was united in a principled objection to philanthropists' unequal wealth and their unequal power and their unequal status. But they differed in terms of its overall its place in an overall strategy for challenging the very inequalities that bring philanthropy into being. So I want to start by looking at the question of principle on which we were all agreed, and then I'll move on to questions of strategy. So on the matter of principle, and some of this has obviously already been covered, all the attack activists would agree that philanthropy violates egalitarian ideals in very significant ways. And here I'm obviously drawing on other scholars' work. There's a growing literature on the political theory of philanthropy, for example, and Ciara Cordelli, Saunders Hastings, you can look at my published work for the references. So we would have been in agreement that philanthropy arises from and helps to legitimate inequalities inherent in the capitalist system, inequalities of wealth and power, control over the productive process, the subordination of caring and solidary relations. It also legitimizes massive wealth inequalities because it makes people believe that we need philanthropy to fund services and meet needs. But of course, this is only true in the context of low tax economies. But politically, philanthropy, and this has already been said, gives donors the power to make decisions about issues of public policy, decisions which typically exclude the voices of those affected by them. Even when those affected are included, it still gives donors much more influence than other citizens. And this also has legacy effects for those donors who impose conditions after they've died. From a Republican perspective, philanthropy is also a form of arbitrary power because donors can give or withdraw their money at will. And finally, the resource inequalities upon which philanthropy depends generate differences in status that are incompatible with the ideal of equal citizenship. It creates unequal and undignified relations of dependence, particularly when it is responsible for the provision of basic services. It erodes democratic solidarity by supplanting citizens' obligations to jointly provide for the welfare of others. So far, so clear. However, the problem, of course, is that in and of themselves, these objections are, well, I guess depending on your point of view, are insufficient in guiding difficult strategic and tactical decisions faced by movements that are committed to transformative egalitarian change, but who may struggle to sustain their activities in contexts where other sources of financial support are unavailable, insufficient, or hostile to their aims. So what is to be done? This, of course, brings us to the question of strategy. What risks, tensions, and trade-offs do movements face should they accept philanthropic funding? And in the complex, actually existing societies in which we live, what strategies do we have to minimize them? So I think it's helpful to approach this topic through the lens of what Erich Olin Wright calls real utopias. And this is akin to Gore's concept of non-reformist reforms. In other words, this calls for strategies that help build real egalitarian change in the here and now, but that do so in a way that holds fast to transformative political goals. So the key point here is that it is not just about accepting any old social reform. Rather, the guiding question is whether the strategy or policy in question contributes to, rather than shuts down or narrows or undermines the transition to a just society. Political theorists sometimes frame this in terms of ideal versus non-ideal theory. So thinking about philanthropy by no means eliminates its risks, but what maybe is helpful is that it offers certain value-based, normative guidelines as a basis for decision making. So it accords some philanthropy a provisional and contingent role in supporting movement action, so long as it pushes existing configurations of power in more egalitarian directions. But I think it also challenges this kind of unreflexive, funding at all costs approach that's adopted by some NGOs. There's money there, we absolutely have to take it. So what does this mean in practice? So I only have a few minutes left. So I think that it means that if movements are to accept philanthropic funding, it must offer a strategic possibility of a non-reformist reform. And it must realise certain egalitarian norms with how movements organise, which are often compromised in the context of movement philanthropic relationships. So I'll just offer a few suggestions in the last few minutes. On the first of these points in relation to transformative goals and sustaining a focus on non-reformist reforms, I think organisations should try to minimise the risk of normalising philanthropy as just another partner in the process of social change, thereby obscuring its unjust origins. So for this, they must clearly, consistently and deliberately articulate their transformative commitments, including the goal of transforming the economic system upon which philanthropy's existence depends. In tandem with this, they must clarify and articulate the role of philanthropy in their work, that is to say, as a tactical contingent response to an unjust world. Secondly, and there's a large sociological literature on this, organizations should recognize that movement co-option to donor agendas often happens by stealth through, for example, the application of ostensibly neutral managerial frameworks which channel or contain political activities. I think awareness of this might help them to manage the funding relationship and lessen the chance that they'll modify their aims to satisfy donor priorities. Thirdly, funded organizations should maintain a strong relationship with organizations that are not philanthropically funded so as to remain part of and crucially accountable to that larger movement. With respect to egalitarian norms of organizing, there's two kind of aspects here, two dimensions of equality. There's firstly political equalities and secondly the issue of solidarity, which conceptually is a form of effective equality. So, I think our keynote speaker has been involved in trying to democratize philanthropy, and there is a growing literature on this. Of course, this doesn't solve the democratic problem, but it might temper it. From the point of view of movements, what can movements do in relation to political equalities? Well, firstly, they can push for their funders to be more democratic, and in particular to include the voices of affected communities in decision-making. They should challenge their funder if the funder, as a representative, if the executives of the foundation concerned are engaging with policymakers directly. They should speak up and oppose that. They should try to resist funder conditionalities that promote the power and paternalism of philanthropies. And of course, they should organize their own work in a politically egalitarian way that avoids funder-driven NGOization, in other words, where decision-making power, campaigning activities, and all the interesting work of activism become concentrated in a cadre of managerial and policy professionals. They can develop systems of accountability to the wider citizenry, such as fora in which members of the public can gain information and raise concerns about the role of philanthropy. Finally, because movement building should take precedence over institution building, funded organizations should cease their relationship with philanthropy if collective goals can be better secured by other groups. Sorry, I have to put my glasses on to see. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, thanks. I'll make it in 2 minutes. The second aspect I want to speak to is the question of solidarity. As I said, in the theoretical literature, this is regarded as a form of effective equality, but the relations of solidarity can be compromised by philanthropic funding, and this isn't just the donor's fault. I mean, organizations can be ruthlessly competitive amongst themselves, so that's one thing, but just to say, I think this is a really important point, not just because solidarity is intrinsically valuable as a value, but also because competition can block the very collaboration and alliances that are required to secure egalitarian goals. So one practical thing that funded organizations can do is to reject marketized organizational practices that entrench and legitimate capitalism's competitive logic, and this is very common. I'm thinking here of things like performance-based management models or branding campaigns that seek to claim a social issue, a policy goal, or a campaigning approach as one's own, as a means of distinguishing the organization from their, competitors. In other words, their fellow citizen groups. They can also neutralize competitive relations by sharing information across the movement about available funding streams, and where necessary, providing support in completing funding applications, especially to groups with less experience or insider knowledge of such processes. Okay, so to conclude, in this short input, I've tried to just sketch a path, really, through the inevitable, and they are inevitable, dilemmas of philanthropy for egalitarian movements. To return to the case of a tax Irish branch, which I should say did not take the money, and which disbanded shortly afterwards, but for unrelated reasons. My own view is that taking the money could potentially have opened the space for a non-reformist reform, because we could have used it to challenge the interests of financial capital. But I also think that it could have been risky because we could have potentially alienated potential allies in a way that could potentially have undermined the ultimate goals of the organization. So I think what this suggests is that there's no hard and fast rule for these decisions, and that they must be made in context, attentive to the risks, opportunities, and trade-offs that might enable or undermine the struggle for a more egalitarian world. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This was really fascinating and also troubling. So I open the floor. We have approximately 30 minutes now for discussion, and I wonder whether anyone would like to have a comment or question. This is also the time for conclusions. as our speakers also related to some of the previous contributors to the conference. Of course, you are also free to make some comment, whether conclusive or not.
Thank you all for your contributions. They obviously fit very well with our panel in the morning, and I can feel how intertwined we are, and in some ways going perhaps a bit beyond just a legalistic framework which doesn't look at a revolutionary future, but also thinking of how radicalized, I think, the sphere of philanthropy has become. And I was wanting to make a comment and a question for you, which actually reflects back on yesterday as well. A type of power that we have not considered, partly because it wasn't in our brief, but which I think is actually completely intertwined with philanthropy, which is intertwined with big corporations, which is intertwined with democracy, is the power of military and paramilitary organizations. I touched on this a little bit in my talk, though I didn't talk or name the paramilitary organizations that are sort of embedded in keeping alive the interests of the state in India. But I'm just wondering in relation to philanthropy, because I know, for example, the Hewlett Foundation and many of these tech companies are intertwined with designing military technologies, right? We heard about that in the previous panel. We heard about that in relation to drones. I'm just wondering, in relation to the police, the prison system, how much any of you have followed some of the scandals around the American privatized prison system and how philanthropy is entwined with that. Koch, for example, as a foundation, have been intertwined with these far-right Christian nationalist groups. They're also, of course, funding so-called progressive causes in some places and not in others. So I just wondered about whether anybody here in the room or on the panel has studied military intertwinement with philanthropic funding.
Thank you. I have 2.5 questions. First is that what I heard makes sense, but it's a little bit philosophical, intellectual, but in practice, things sometimes look different. I ran an NGO for the last 7 years, entirely funded from philanthropy, from a number of different entities, some who were mentioned here, others not. But the point I'm trying to make is, and ask your views about this, that in reality, when you work with philanthropy, then you can actually work out a modus vivendi that does not necessarily force you in a certain direction. And there were some of these philanthropies that were easier to work with, and there were others that were a bit more difficult. So any thoughts on that? The second, and this is my biggest issue, is that, and I had that criticism for this work also that I led for 7 years, is that philanthropy creates the agenda by funding something. And in this case, they created the agenda to talk about something very controversial. Geoengineering, solar radiation modification, these kinds of issues. And how can we think about that? How could philanthropic entities engage better in societal conversations so that they actually pick on topics that make sense from a societal point of view? And my half a point is that we're entering an era where there's a lot less money in the system. And there will be a lot more pressure to go to these philanthropic entities because there simply isn't any money around.
My question would, I would present Rob Reich's argument for philanthropy, which is domination happens everywhere. So, trade unions can be sometimes dominating, political parties can be dominating, elected majorities can be dominating. And his argument for philanthropy is, well, it's another type of power and increases the pluralism of power and potential domination. But since it increases the pluralism, there is less concentrated power, right? So, which is not necessarily true, but I was wondering how you would think about this.
Hello, everybody. I come from a very small pocket of the Soros Foundation's legacy, which is the Roma rights movement. And I've been wondering all my life. Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm coming from the Roma rights pocket of the Soros Foundation, you know, like being funded and then being a funder and all. So my question is a counterfactual. Would the world be a better place without the Soros Foundation or similar progressive philanthropies? Because in the Roma rights movement, it seems to me that the movement itself would not have existed without the Soros Foundation, regardless of the domination discourses. And obviously the same question arises in relation to the whole philanthropic exercise, okay? Would the world be a better place without all the philanthropies? Because maybe if it would, then we could actually throw under the bus the progressive foundations as well.
Okay, so this was the first round. I think very good questions and a little bit counterbalancing all your critics. So who would like to take the floor first? Yes, Alvaro. Is it on? Would you check, please?
It's on. I wanted to react.
Closed. You have to.
I wanted to react to Jano's comments. At least I have lost 1.5 questions, but I have one which I wrote down and refers to your experience with your NGO. And in my model, what happens is that you are a case of multiple donors. When a recipient, an NGO, has access to different donors, it can pit one donor against the other and try to get money for B if the donor is not ready to pay for B, only for A. But I want to challenge you and to ask you, have you really gotten money for everything you wanted to do, and did you get the money when you wanted to have it? Or have you made compromises? And maybe even ask you to go deeper into your memories and think whether it could not be the case, it could be the case that you have forgotten that you wanted to do certain things, and at some point you realized it was impossible because nobody wanted to pay for that, and you even forgot and you redefined your preferences according to the availability of funding. And I've seen these things in the historical record. Recipients which celebrate the donor years after a grant, but they forget that during the negotiation of the grant, they actually lost many battles. They got money, but only for a fraction of what they wanted to do. So this is part of the story of philanthropy. If you have access to multiple donors, you are in a better position as a recipient. There is another important factor is whether a recipient can be replaced by another. If you are the single NGO or academic organization in a certain place conducting an activity or proposing to conduct an activity, then the donor may have no option but taking you. In that kind of situation, the donor has few or only one course of action open because there is only one potential recipient. But these are situations which are not usual. In most of the times, you will have more potential recipients than active donors. I'll leave it here that others can also intervene.
On the last question, I suppose that's the kind of dilemma I was trying to work through. I think that there is a case for taking philanthropy sometimes because we need the money sometimes to use it to build a better world. Do you know what I mean? But I think it has to be done within certain normative parameters, and it has to be done. I think NGOs need to kind of develop a bit of a critical literacy around philanthropy rather than just going, yay, there's some money, let's go, let's get it. Do you know what I mean? And screw the consequences. And I suppose have some of the conversations that we're having here. But I do think there is a case for taking it sometimes if it can be used in some of the ways that I described. So that's just on that question. Rob Reich, I've read his work. I'm not really convinced that it does promote pluralism, but I think it might promote. It can fund uncontroversial things. It can fund minority things that are not, that go against, that can be important. But I think to do that more democratically, I think you probably want to experiment with things like citizen assemblies, deliberative fora, to help decide on what those things are. Do you know what I mean? And I think there is probably more interest, some other literature around that. I think that might be more helpful. was there anything else? I don't have anything to say. On the NGOs in practice, I think you're right. I think that the foundations vary in terms of, the modus vivendi, as you said. Some foundations are more hands-off than others. And I think organizations do work things out. And that can lead to, to positive outcomes. I did research on a foundation in Ireland called the One Foundation. And the money came from a guy called Declan Ryan, who was from, Ryan as in from Ryanair. So it wasn't actually Ryanair money, but it was his personal wealth derived from from his involvement in that corporation. They had a very strange model of venture philanthropy. It was very kind of marketized. It was very about, kind of a Dragon's Den sort of a scenario in terms of trying to kind of decide on grantees. But there's always contingencies. And what happened is they actually ended up funding this organization that was campaigning on migrant workers' rights, that was involved in trade union organizing. And we know that Ryanair is pretty hostile to, trade union organizing. Now, they didn't set out to do that. It just happened through the relationship. They were actually interested in disadvantaged children. But they funded this NGO because they were helping migrant workers, and that would help the disadvantaged children. Do you know what I mean? And so it just worked itself out in the organization, and they actually had an excellent relationship. So I totally agree with you. There's always kind of ways of working things out. But I just think we always have to be super attentive to the risks as well, and always have the bigger picture that we really should be taxing these guys. I don't have anything to say on the military stuff. So I think you might.
Yeah, thank you. The only element of military kind of support for the military that I've seen in the work I've done was in regard to support for Latin American organizations which were close to the militaries there, in particular Chile, in which, but even that was approached through economists. The economists are the Trojan horse through which much of the power of the big philanthropies in many societies actually operate, including in the United States itself. Related to paramilitaries, the Hewlett Foundation has supported with many millions of dollars American Compass, which is one of the authors of Project 2025. In virtually 50 to 70% of the budget of American Compass was paid for by the Hewlett Foundation. They also supported the trustees of the Hewlett Foundation operate companies which donated very large amounts of money to election-denying Republican candidates and very illiberal and anti-liberal such candidates too. And so when you look at the election denying, then you kind of see the insurrection of 6th of January and the elements which are involved there. So they are involved with a kind of variety of political forms, and Hewlett was doing it under the banner of diversity, ideological diversity. But their ideological diversity meant $2 million plus to American Compass and those sorts of organizations, and nothing to grassroots and activist types of organizations themselves. To the colleague who talked about the promotion of pluralism by philanthropy. Now, of course, there are many, many philanthropies, thousands of them. Many of them are local, probably the vast majority, relatively small, and therefore they have very different motivations. The kind of philanthropists, so-called philanthropies that I've looked at, Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and now more recently Hewlett, these are large corporate philanthropies, and they are not promoting pluralism. They may use the term pluralism, democracy, strengthening constitutional processes, and that kind of thing. What effectively they're doing is organizing elite networks, think tanks, elements of the state, universities, law firms, lawyers, and media organizations, and so on, and making them much more effective in perpetuating their own elite power. Hewlett has got a whole load of documents on its website, which it calls a living archive, in which it openly rules out two things. One, big money is not a problem for American democracy. So they rule out campaigning or anything in on campaign finance reform in any kind of serious way. Secondly, they ruled out supporting any grassroots movements for change which were fighting for democratic rights at this particular time either. So what effectively appears to be going on is that they've got a particular idea about who are the Democrats and who are the dangers to democracy. And when you look through their papers, the dangers to democracy are the people who basically, who are tweeting irresponsibly in midnight, and not the big organizations which are actually organizing the tech platforms, which are enabling very, very powerful right-wing organizations to do their kind of dirty work. If there was a world without foundations, I think we'd have a good party, because the kind of foundations I've looked at, they have not contributed in any significant way. So when you look at, Zsuzsanna talked about the late 19th century and early 20th century origins, particularly of Rockefeller and Carnegie. The way they made their money was extremely unethical, to say the least, illegal very often, and so on. Secondly, they were a response to populism of the left. They were the sponsors of so-called progressivism, which was an attempt to take the wind out of the sails of populism, which stood for nationalization, the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and so on. Took the wind out of the trade union movements, which are much more militant at that particular time. And what they wanted was to modernize the American political system, which is deeply corrupt, largely because of the sort of practices they themselves engaged in. And they wanted to take the sail out of the wind out of the sails of the socialist, labor, and other kind, anarchist, wobblies, and other sorts of movements. That is to say, they came as an intervention in order to prevent radical change and to channel it into particular kinds of directions. And that has not fundamentally changed. So when you look at Hewlett and you look at his beautiful website with his performative radicalism, and then you read, it has actually not said a single word about Donald Trump 2.0 since he was elected. But they have supported American Compass and many other bodies which contributed to the labor sections of Project 2025. And when you look at Project 2025, it is basically a charter for authoritarianism and presidential dictatorship, which is precisely what has happened in that country. He's trying to shut down so many sources. So I would argue that a world without foundations, in effect, is a world without another form of concentrated wealth, which is used by people who are given all the power to decide who's the problem, what's the problem, who are going to be involved in the solution to the problem, and how should it be implemented, and by whom. That you're effectively ceding power to people, groups of people, who are not accountable to anybody. And these foundations are totally unaccountable. They don't pay taxes, they don't have electors, they don't stand in elections, they do exactly what they please. They are basically a venture capital for the capitalistic forces which set them up in the first place. And they try all kinds of experiments to try to maintain basically systems out of crises. And in the paper which I've written on the Hewlett Foundation, I call it a liberal crisis machine. It diagnoses crises and it prescribes solutions to crises. And when you look at this diagnosis and its solutions, its prescriptions, they're very, very conservative indeed, and not designed really to make any radical changes.
Thank you. I wanted to ask both, I think, Alvaro and Niamh. Am I pronouncing it correctly? Alvaro, I found your talk really enlightening and deeply troubling in the sense of, so thinking about what you said and how to drive that message home in the sense of us being a university who is highly dependent on a single donor. And I very much appreciated Niamh's comments on how to create or how to have a framework for decision making on whether you take or do not take philanthropic money. But at the same time, I realized that so it's laying on the assumption that there's a pre-existing organization that can decide whether or not to take that money. And definitely that's that's not our case here. So it's a university that was funded at the same time with the money. So there's no prior organization there that can make a decision whether to take or decline. And it looks like the sort of checklist or questions in this framework that you propose that these organizations should ask themselves. These are questions that you can ask to yourself once, so before you take the money. And my question now here to maybe both of you or the three of you is, what do you do when you're already neck deep in this dynamic? Is there a way of, breaking free from this that would not imply annulling your existence? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My question is in the relationship between foundation funding and state funding. I work for an organization that is funded both directly by states and by a foundation, one of the big ones that was nominated at a certain point. Do you think that there are substantially different practices in the funding that state gives and the funding that foundation gives? And whether they are competing or cooperating? Because in my experience, there is a lot of alignment between what foundation and states decide to fund, especially in the Global South. Like, I come from an organization in the Global North that works in the Global South. And a lot of the state funding that goes to the Global South, it's also directed with a very deliberate and specific political program that does not support any of the things that they say they support. And especially coming from aid, right? It's very hard to imagine a world in which funding can be democratized regardless of where it comes from. So any reflection on any of these things would be quite interesting for me to hear. Thank you.
Okay, is there any other question? So if not, I also would like to ask you as a part of this final round. So as you said, Inderjeet, they're not all foundations are the same, right? We cannot think that all of them want just dominance. We can and we should hope that there are many of them who are actually want to do something good. So what would you suggest to them to make themselves more reflective, more democratic in their decision making? What would you, according to your studies, how would they do better their donations? And well, obviously, the ones, especially with the big money, are not for radical change, right? They are not for revolutions. Actually, revolutions is dangerous, so it can go also bad. So we cannot be surprised that they are for more cautious reform. Still, where would they put their money? If you would have a lot of money, where would you put it now for better democracy in our world? Would like to start?
Theorists who argued that philanthropic money should not be viewed as a form of distributive justice, for all the reasons we discussed here, is a form of reparative justice. You're making up for a harm that has been done to the poor, and I think that I find that very useful framing. That it should be seen as an illegitimate source of wealth. So, I mean, if you're asking me what I would do if I was a billionaire, first of all, I would fund activist groups who are, I mean, I know I would say that after everything I've said, but I would fund activist groups who are fighting against an unjust economic system, and I would do that democratically. But, I mean, it sounds so pat to say that, do you know what I mean? And I also think if it can have such distorting effects in practice, do you know what I mean? If you've that much money to give away, it creates all sorts of weird relationships, but that is what I would do. I would, and also I would be hands-off and let citizens decide how the money was spent. But I don't think that you can, like I said, I don't think you can solve the democratic problem, because it's just fundamentally an undemocratic thing for one person to be deciding what to do with all that money. Sorry, I'll let someone else speak. Well, I think any other answers?
there is a lot on our plate. I will leave the question about how to spend the money for the end. And I want to go back to some of the questions of the first round, but very quickly. I think unless you suppress modern capitalism, there is a positive role to play for foundations. And I think that they have done a couple of good things, including in Latin America and in Chile. The Ford Foundation gave money to the Chicago economists in Santiago de Chile long before the coup of Pinochet in 1973, and then expend a lot of money, energy, and prestige, and some of the Ford Foundation officers risked their lives to take scholars and activists out of the country and save their lives. And they funded human rights activism and social sciences in Chile under Pinochet for 15 years. And they founded the civil rights movement in the US. So the question is that foundations are different, and even the same foundation can be very different. Ford Foundation in 1950 is a completely different thing than the Ford Foundation in 1970 or 1980. So you have to, foundations are historical as every other social formation. You have to look to the specifics and see what they are doing, what's going on. I agree more with Inderjeet himself of the lack of accountability, which is why I spoke earlier about the autonomy of the boards. This should be changed. I mean, it's, I'm not a US citizen, but even for any habitant of the world, it is scandalous that the Gates Foundation had in its board for many years only members of the Gates Foundation and Warren Buffett. And this is money which is actually US public money, which the tax authority leaves to the foundation to administer. And this is something which, by the way, the Open Society in its early times was the same. It was George Soros and his wife administering the money. So this should not happen. This is a point, an aspect which should be changed. What can organization do which does not have an option but to take the money? To look for other donors is the only way forward. And but the question is, and this is again very negative from a normative point of view. Every foundation worth its salt will look for areas of activity, for fields and Burdeian terms, where they are the only donors or one of the very few donors. They will look for places where their money makes a difference and when there is a range of potential recipients so that they can impose their conditions. Here I like to quote a friend of mine who was a foundation officer in charge of the human rights program, and he says foundations use recipients as vehicles for their agendas. So there is always resistance, and going back to Janus, the possibility of having multiple donors, etc. So sometimes there is a way out, but the parting position for most recipients is a very disadvantageous one. And let me conclude. There are two Hewlett foundations. There are two Hewlett foundations because the family is not only a family, but there are several family members and they have different foundations. And one of them funds this research group which is openly critical of capitalism. People like Kim Slobodian, who has been mentioned yesterday, is involved there, and some other scholars who are openly critical of capitalism. So there is also this possibility of using foundation money to elaborate a critique of capitalism. And by the way, this is another thing which Ford did in in Santiago de Chile in the 1960s and 70s, they paid for many people who were on the left. So.
Great, thank you. There's 1,000 questions, and reality is more sophisticated than it is possible to kind of summarize here. I would just add the Indonesian army in the 1950s and 60s as very closely working with Ford Foundation and so on as a vehicle for national development, and that the coup which occurred in the mid-60s bore a direct relationship with some aspects of that too. Foundation versus state funding. I think one of the things is, of course, the foundations operate on a fiction of independence from the state, independence from business, independent from the market, and so independent from politics and ideology, etc. But actually, in practice, when we look at the boards of trustees of the big foundations, they rotate, circulate, revolve doors, blah, 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 with the American state and with other parts of the thing. So that is to say, they live in the same mental world, but they may well have different priorities and different roles at different times. And of course, the American foundations are quite interesting because the liberal foundations get hauled up by Congress every generation. 1916 by the left, 1950s by the extreme right, then the early 21st century by George W. Bush as pro-Palestinian terrorists and so on, and no doubt something will happen again. So there is a kind of ambiguous relationship. And in the 1920s, the big foundations spent a large amount of money against isolationism and for globalism. So they are in and around the state, and they weave their web and so on. But I would say there are some distinctions between the private and the public. And I think we'll see now probably many liberal foundations stepping in where Donald Trump is doing so much more damage. And they do tend to go and minimize the damage. So the Reagan era, Thatcher era, a lot of private foundations stepped in, and then they stepped back out again and so on. But what they do is reasonably conservative in terms of the boundaries of what they try to achieve. You asked, what would a reflective philanthropy look like? I published my book, Foundations of the American Century, in 2012. I think the Rockefeller Foundation people got hold of it. They invited me to go and give a talk there. They hadn't read the book yet. I turned up there. That was the coldest, most frosty reception I've ever received. There was 30 of them. Each one had a copy of my book, which I was very pleased to see, with about 1 billion footnotes on every page. And they proceeded to tell me that Gramsci could not possibly be used to look at history, that I couldn't possibly say anything about the history of the foundation because I had never met any of the people that I'd written about, largely because they were already dead, and so on and so forth. That is to say, and then they left me outside waiting for a taxi in this place in the top of a mountain, Sleepy Hollow, and when they were all driving off in their cars. That is to say, I don't think they're very reflective. And you can see this on their internal reports. Every 10 years, they wring their hands and they cry, oh dear, we failed in practically every program we established to alleviate hunger, poverty, distress of various forms. And then they decide, we've now got to renew our mission and go to the grassroots people, local empowerment, and they will select various people from their own networks to then build the next generation of 10 years worth of programs. I don't think that these very large foundations want to reflect in any deep and thoroughgoing way on what they do, and so I wouldn't hold out too much promise. Where would I suggest large amounts of money go? I take my cue from Nikos Palantzis. He said there are two roles for the state and elites in capitalist societies. The role of the state is to organize the ruling class and to disorganize the subject class. I would say you have to organize and help empower those who are fighting against the kind of injustices which are very basic and very extreme in our societies, in this country, in Britain, in the United States, and so on. There are children who are hungry in a very wealthy society. You would empower communities to be able to enable them to fight for change, which would then stop that level of inequality and poverty and distress, in my view. Not build more elites, elite networks, elite think tanks, elite organizations, and people have already got large amounts of privileges and PhDs from Harvard and Yale and so on and so forth to get even more power for themselves. That's what I would suggest be done.
Well, thank you very much. I think it was lots of thought. While I tend to believe that we are here at the CEU Democracy Institute change makers, or at least this is what we'd like to be for a better. And also, we are living in a time of revolution. There's a autocratic revolution is going on with a lot of funding from states and from private money and big wealth. So we have a lot to do to counter this whenever we can get force from either from small money or small people or small knowledge, which we would like to generate here and elsewhere. So thank you very much for coming, and I pass the floor to Ruth now.
Thank you.
for
I'd
all
like
of
to
you.
give a round of applause for the panel.